beyond the forbidden.
Welcome to Beyond the Forbidden. Today on the show, I got my favorite researcher of all time. He is, I call a friend, and I visited him a couple times in the past, do face-to-face interviews. He's been on the show many times in the past also. Mr. Joseph Farrell, how you doing, man?
Pretty good. How are you, Mike?
Good. So it's almost a year now since I had you on the show. Yeah, almost a year. I think it was April. And we talked a lot about transhumanism and artificial intelligence. And maybe we can do part 2 of that whenever I come see you in a month or two. But today I want to talk a little bit about your Giza Death Star visited, and specifically the demon in Ekur. And it's got a hell of a subtitle: Angels, Demons, Plasma, Patristics, and Pyramids. Man. So remember I told you before, Joseph, that I don't know if I told you on podcast or when I went to go see you. I think I went to go see you one time, that your books, all of them, one way or another, they interconnect.
Right.
And I asked you, did you intentionally do that?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
So does this book kind of interconnect like everything else does, The Demon in Ekur?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. For those who haven't read my books, when I started writing these books, they started with the Giza Death Star trilogy, which is no longer in print, which is why I did the Giza Death Star Revisited, to update the original 3 books, rearrange the arguments so that the argument was clearer for people, and also updated some of the technology that had appeared since I originally wrote the book. And now technology that when I wrote the books, I thought, this is so far-fetched what I'm talking about. And they've gone and done it, So it required a rewrite. But part of the rewrite, Mike, was when I lay out my books, I lay out my books about 4 or 5 titles ahead of what I'm writing on or what's actually published. So all the books are deliberately connected. You can read them in any order that you want, but they have been laid out in a particular order. And if you want to know the order, just go to my website, click the About tab, and it will list the books more or less in the order of their publication. That's the order I intended them to be read, but you can read them in any order that you want, and those connections will become apparent to people. That's the way I've laid them out. That said, when I originally wrote the very first book in this crazy whatever it is I'm doing, the Giza Death Star, I originally sent it off to a publisher that rejected the book ultimately. But in between the time I sent it off to the publisher and the publisher's rejection, I kept writing and revising the book. And in the original version that I sent the publisher, you know me, I have epigraphs at the heading of every chapter because I just like epigraphs. And I included an epigraph in the original version of Giza Death Star, an epigraph from Zecharia Sitchin, that when they rejected the book, I thought, oh, thank goodness, because now I can get rid of that epigraph. I don't have to include it, and I can rewrite the book with all the new stuff I've discovered. So that's what I did, and then I sent the book to David Childress at Adventures Unlimited, and he published it. So anyway, when I rewrote the original 3 books and kind of rearranged the argument in Giza Death Star Revisited, I restored that original epigraph to the Giza Death Star Revisited. The reason I took it out originally was because the epigraph that Sitchin, that I quoted, basically attributed a demon to be kind of the resident of the Great Pyramid. And I thought, okay, it's wild enough that we're talking about the Great Pyramid in terms of a weapon. We don't need to add demons to the mix. That's why I took it out.
And this
Okay.
was late 90s, early 2000s, I believe.
2001 was when that first book came out.
So
Right.
times have changed since then. So it's a little bit different now
Well,
compared to, I can only imagine back then, you know.
it's different because the reason that if you read the books out there closely, if you're really paying attention, every time I talk about physics, I'm talking about the one thing that unites them all is plasma. Okay. And the reason I originally put that epigraph in and then took it out was because I was aware, like some people who know a little bit about plasma physics are aware, that some physicists who have worked with plasmas have come to the conclusion that they might be alive. That's the problem. David Bohm, classic case in point, very famous physicist, worked in the Manhattan Project on plasmas. And as he was working on plasmas, he thought, oh my word, I'm observing behavior that's very typical of life. We'll get back to that. So I decided, okay, what happened to restore the epigraph in the Giza Death Star Revisited, and the reason I put it back in was because I fully intended to do a webinar on my website about what I'm calling the plasma life hypothesis. Okay. And the reason why I decided to do it was because Robert Temple, if you're not familiar with that author, he's an author well worth getting to know.
The serious mystery.
The serious mystery, the netherworld. But he recently came out just last year with a book called The New Science of Heaven, which is all about plasmas and the plasma life hypothesis. And the reason I decided to do The Demon in the Ekur was because, first of all, he's laid out in one book a basically comprehensive compendium of everybody out there who's thinking along the lines of the plasma life hypothesis. The other reason I decided to do the book is, you know me, I'm a very traditional patristic theologian, and Temple's problem is he wants to connect all of this to Gnosticism. He has no time, and shame on him, to go check the traditional Christian sources to see what they might have to say that might be relevant. So in The Demon in the Ekur book, I put about a 15-page extensive, lengthy quotation from a very well-known church father by the name of St. John of Damascus, all about angels. And it's very clear from the passage in question that what he's talking about in terms of the materiality of angels and how he talks about that could be very easily adapted to what these modern plasma life people are talking. In fact, as I point out in that quotation, Damascus even has kind of his own version of the quantum uncertainty principle with reference to angels, which coming when it does centuries ago is kind of a head scratcher. But anyway,
for the newcomers, Joseph, before you go any further, because I've been looking forward to this show for a couple months, and I got some pretty good notes wrote down, but go ahead and explain a little bit what plasma is according to you and your research, and maybe others also, for the newcomers out there.
All right, it's very simple. Plasma is the sun. It's that hot gas in the sun. Plasma is what happens when you set off a nuclear bomb. It's the stuff in the fireball. Plasma is also, you can have cool plasmas. Anytime you get a severe thunderstorm, you're probably dealing with a lot of plasma up there in the clouds, because what your plasmas basically is a state of matter, any state of matter where the electrons and the nucleus of the atoms have become split apart. So in other words, let's say you're dealing with a uranium plasma. Okay, you've made a plasma out of uranium. You've put it into gas form and made a plasma out of it. What that means is that the uranium is no longer existing in an atomic state. It's no longer in atoms. You've got all the uranium electrons over here, and you've got all the uranium nucleus or ions over there. So it's in this dipolar state. You can find plasmas in clouds. You can find very thin, dusty plasmas in between the Earth and the Moon. That particular plasma is called the Kordylewski cloud. There's actually a plasma structure in the known universe that, get this, is 137 billion.
You say B billion
with
or
a
million?
B with a B. It's 137 billion light years long. Now, do the math, folks. If light is traveling at 186,000 miles approximately per second, then that's 60 times 60 times 24 times 365 times 137 billion.
How I heard you before say it's so many Milky Way galaxies or something like that.
It works out to approximately 344,000 diameters of the Milky Way galaxy. That's one plasma structure in the universe. Now, folks,
how do physicists explain that?
Well, that's my other problem. How does a structure like that arise and then keep itself together if, the great Alberts, you can't have any transmission of information faster than the velocity of, how does that system even arise? And, while we're at it, let's talk about the spiral character of galaxies. Well, when you get into this plasma stuff, you'll discover that there's a whole plasma cosmology out there. And I wrote about it in my book, The Cosmic War. So I'm going back to what I told people earlier. All of my books, I've been dancing around this plasma issue, the Nazi Bell, the Philadelphia Experiment, The Cosmic War, for a very long time. Thank you, Robert Temple, for being out there, having the guts to get out there and do the Plasma Life Hypothesis book, because I quite frankly was afraid to. Because people already think I'm a good candidate for a rubber padded room. I don't.
Well, my wife is a psych nurse, so
okay, thank you. Anyway, so
didn't Gregory, not to cut you off, didn't Gregory Little, Dr. Gregory Little, he's out of Memphis. Didn't he start talking about some plasmas? I'm not sure. I'll get back to you later on that.
People have been talking about plasma cosmology for Hannes Alfvén, the Swedish physicist. He's a Nobel laureate physicist, so he's not a fly by night. Was talking about plasma cosmology for a very long time, and in my book, The Demon in the Ekur, another reason I did the book is I have excerpts from Dr. Alfvén's major works on plasmas, and also a set of quotations from his student, Dr. Anthony Peratt. And people will be familiar with that name that have read my book, The Cosmic War. But basically, when you read Dr. Alfvén, it's very funny because, here's a guy who chooses his language very carefully. Very carefully. And he talks about all the wonderful theories about plasma that were circulating in the 1950s, of course, in connection with the hydrogen bomb. And all the talk began about having controlled fusion as a really good way to produce lots of clean energy. And Alfvén is talking about all these controlled fusion experiments in his book, and I quote this, and then he says, but the plasmas did not cooperate with the theory. And, to use that kind of diction and ascribe agency to what he's experimenting with, I'm thinking, okay, here's another scientist that's encountered this very strange behavior of these plasmas. All right, so what's the strange behavior? Let's go back to David Bohm.
Do you want to help support Beyond Forbidden and receive extra content that's not seen anywhere else? By becoming a patron, a few things you will receive are the full-length 90-minute or 120-minute podcast episode. Members will also receive a private link of the video podcast and will only be exclusive to Patreon members. In-person, face-to-face interviews with some of the most well-known, respected researchers. Behind-the-scenes footage of interviews not seen anywhere else. And that's just a few perks. So what do you have to lose? Cut out one brain-rotting, overly processed Happy Meal a month that doesn't do anything beneficial for your mind, body, and spirit, and become a Patreon for just $5.
When Bohm was working on the Manhattan Project and making uranium plasmas, he discovered a very interesting thing. Every time that he put in an electrical probe inside the plasma to take measurements of what was going on inside of it, the plasma would react by constructing a sheath, a kind of electromagnetic sheath around the probe, so that the probe wouldn't work and he could take no measurements. Now, folks, like it or not, that is exactly the same kind of response as your body has when a bacterium or virus or germ enters your immune system, and that's exactly what your immune system does. It encases that foreigner with a lot of cells so that thing cannot attach itself to your body. That's what it does.
Isn't our neurons and electrical signals basically some other type of plasma?
Well, this is the other thing. If you look at, and I put these pictures in the book, if you look
beautiful
at,
cover too. I love the cover. Love the cover. Awesome cover.
If you look at well, we'll get to the cover in a minute, but if you look at the structure of plasma filaments in the universe and then compare them to the structure of neurons and synapses in a brain, they are remarkably similar. In fact, I would go so far as to say you're dealing with identical structure. And this is why many people in the plasma cosmology hypothesis, the plasma life hypothesis, are thinking in terms that this means that these gigantic plasma structures like the Great Sloan Wall that have been around, almost forever, might have intelligence. Well, stop and think about that. If you're dealing with something that has intelligence and a memory that's 137 billion years old, that's kind of off the charts when it comes to us. So yeah, if what I'm getting at here is that the plasma life hypothesis appears to be coming around to the ancient traditional view that angels and demons are quite literally the intellectual bodiless powers. That's what the ancients would call them. Why? Because in terms of our materiality, they're basically immaterial. But as Damascus says, in comparison to God, they're still material. They're just much, much, much less dense than we are. So, pardon my hiccups.
Oh, you're okay.
So that illustration on the cover of the book, I literally told my publisher what I wanted on the cover. I wanted the pyramid, but then I wanted one of these artistic representations of angels as they're described in various biblical and patristic and other literature. And when you read those descriptions, and you can even see old iconography. I should have got one of my icons to show people what I'm talking about. But when you read these descriptions of angels, it almost sounds as if they're describing beings with several axes of symmetry, not just one axis. So in other words, we're symmetrical beings, right and left oriented visually, and to a lesser extent front to back, but right and left symmetry. So we've got one axis of symmetry. If you look at these representations of angels or their descriptions in the Bible, it's like you're dealing with several axes of symmetry. So these things just look bizarre. If you try and represent them in in a two-dimensional picture, they're just very bizarre looking because their wings are going every which way, and they've got all these eyes in very weird places. So yeah, what that is, I think, is the language that is in use in those texts is trying to describe beings that by their nature are what we would probably call hyperdimensional, because they exist literally in a kind of existence that requires that kind of mathematics to describe them. So trying to describe them in ordinary language becomes rather difficult. You try and paint this verbal picture. But yeah, I think those types of illustrations are helpful because they help people kind of visualize what the language is trying to say.
I'm going to I've been waiting to ask you this for a while. And it's going to bring in a little bit of UFO, but I don't want to get onto that. Like you say, maybe we can go around Harvey's barn and maybe get back on UFOs, whatever, down the road.
Okay.
But so I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible, Joseph. And I know what I'm about to say may be a little woo and out there, especially to others who really haven't looked into this, this research that you and Robert Temple and others looked into. But I've heard you before. I don't know when, probably once out of all the many interviews that we've done, that all things are connected like a spider's web.
Right.
And I believe everything is kind of like a spider's web. And this force is beyond our visible spectrum. That probably correlates kind of like a cosmic advanced AI internet or whatever you want to call it. This web is this cosmic Wi-Fi signal, whatever you want to call it, that uses these webs as a source to connect everything from the material world to the unseen world, like a phantom Wi-Fi signal or mechanism. And speaking of this web and possibly trying to connect this sentient plasma energy that you speak of, it made me think of all ball lightning.
Sure.
First off, lightning is energy. And if you Google ball lightning, you will see images of what appears to be streaks of lightning from all over the sky that looks like a spider's web. And this web lightning entangles into a singular source, which they say is the ball lightning. And then you was talking about the synapses a while ago, kind of looks like ball lightning. But what if there is so much more going on here beyond our 5 sense reality and beyond our visible spectrum, Joseph? What if I got a little bit more? Let me read this. What if this spider's web of lightning is somehow connected to the electric universe, and these tentacles of lightning is actually some type of portal that is opening from some type of interdimensional force that is using this energy as a gateway mechanism to manifest and form as a ball of energy and depicted in this ball lightning?
Okay, I get where you're going. So let's unpack all that and try to de-woo it. Okay.
You know me, I love going woo, but
well, I like to go woo too.
Well, I like you to ground me and kind of bring a little bit more
common
sense and science into the picture.
Let's first of all remember what lightning is. Lightning is yet another form of plasma. An arc welder, that's plasma. Okay, all of this stuff is plasma. So in other words, you're dealing with a phenomenon that has lots of subsets of phenomena. Now, when we start talking about interdimensional creatures and portals and all of this claptrap that is in the New Age alternative research community, let's remember one thing about plasmas and electricity. And that one thing was first pointed out by the Hungarian electrical engineering genius by the name of Gabriel Krohn. And he went to work ultimately for General Electric, where he stayed for the rest of his life. And he wrote several textbooks on, here it comes, folks, on the use of tensor calculus in electrical engineering. Now, why is that significant? Well, first of all, tensor calculus or the absolute differential calculus, that's the kind of mathematics that you see in Albert Einstein's general theory of relativity, okay? Now, what Krohn does with the tensor calculus is something very different than Albert Einstein. Krohn actually uses it for practical engineering purposes. And what he does, please latch on to this, folks, because you're not going to understand anything from here on out if you don't really grab this. What Gabriel Krohn does is he shows, by way of tensor calculus, that the equations of electromagnetism, which are generalized rules for what he calls the generalized electrical machine, can be manipulated via tensor calculus to create any specific electrical machine that you need. Now, here's the curveball. In other words, you can take the generalized equations of inductance, impedance, voltage, amperage, all of that stuff, and those generalized laws can be turned by the use of tensor calculus into the electrical schematics for a refrigerator. That's what he's just said, okay? Or for a plasma laser to zap Moscow off the map, okay? It's one and the same set of laws, and it's the same technique that tells you how to get from the general application to the specific. So in other words, this guy is the electrical engineering equivalent of Albert Einstein. He's a genius off the map, in his own little world up there at General Electric. Now, the other thing that Krohn says as a result of applying tensor calculus in these types of plasma electromagnetic situations is that every electrical circuit, from your refrigerator to your toaster to your garage plasma electrical arc laser, okay, everything in the electrical universe, every single circuit is a hyperdimensional object. Why? Because the mathematics necessary to describe that object can only occur in more than 3 dimensions. Just think of imaginary numbers and how often they appear in electrical equations. There you are. So in other words, your toaster, this computer monitor, your microphone, my microphone, all of these devices are by their nature at some degree and at some level hyperdimensional devices. They are already portals. Got it?
Mm-hmm.
Now that we've got it, let's go back to plasma and David Bohm. So Bohm's sitting there and noticing this behavior. And the more of this behavior that you notice, like ball lightning, since we raised that issue, let's talk about ball lightning.
Hello, Foo Fighter.
Hello, Foo Fighter. Hello, Kapitsa in the Soviet Union, doing all of his experiments with ball lightning. Hello, Nazis during World War II, the Karita Anlage project that I write about in all my Nazi books. Why are they interested in this stuff?
Hello, Nazi Bell.
Hello, Nazi Bell. There's another plasma for you. Ding, ding, ding.
You've been talking about for a very long time.
That I've been talking about for a very long time. But what about ball lightning? Well, what are the reports that we have about ball lightning? Well, oddly enough, ball lightning has been observed under some very unusual circumstances, like bouncing along the floors of airplanes, or submerged submarines, or coming down chimneys and then proceeding slowly across the floor. And oftentimes, here's the one that I really flip out when after they come down chimneys, if you've got a Persian rug, an Oriental rug in your room, the ball lightning likes to go and examine the pattern.
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, it exhibits behavior that under some circumstances might be taken as curiosity. So again, you're dealing with something that's clearly a plasma phenomenon. It clearly has odd behavior that suggests it's under some sort of intelligence. And then you've got that tether experiment. I've got to talk about this because some yahoo, some nattering nitwit nabob got onto my website on the forum and started talking about, well, you need to know something about plasma physics, Farrell, because the tether is not a plasma. And I never said that the tether experiment on the space shuttle was a plasma. What I said was that if you examine the NASA space shuttle footage of that experiment that went wrong, after the tether breaks, you see all of this stuff entering the field of view. I even put it up on my website blog. You see all the stuff coming in, and circular stuff, little balls, little discs, and they're going at the tether, and it's like they're curious as to what that thing is. And then this guy goes on to say, well, that's just technology, and it's stealth technology. Well, yeah, that's one way to view it. The other way to view it is it's plasma, and it's coming to investigate something that happened in its realm.
Did this guy vote for Brandon?
Oh, probably. Who knows? Yeah, let's go Brandon. He's got about whoever the person was, he's got to, I have anymore as I get older, I have that much patience for these people.
I got you. Keep on, man. Go ahead.
Well, anyway, but my point is we're dealing with these space shuttle videos that have shown this strange stuff going on up there for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, you can read that what you're seeing is a possible technology. But the other way to look at this is you're reading a natural response from something that may be a very different life form, and it has some modicum of intelligence. So, are we dealing with a nuts and bolts technology being flown around by insectoids from Alpha Centauri, or are we dealing with little balls of plasma that might be living beings and with some intelligence in their own right? Well, that's why we advance the hypothesis.
And whenever you brought up the synapses, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's those little balls that there's these shoots.
Tendrils.
Yes, everywhere.
Tendrils, yeah.
So in my mind, what I think of and it resembles ball lightning in a way. It's almost like ball lightning pierces the veil into this reality, and some could call it interdimensional. I don't know. And maybe that's where some of these UFOs are, maybe we don't know what's in them. We don't know what they are. Maybe they're going through those chutes and
well,
you know what I mean?
Yes, but let's correct the language. What I don't object to the observation as much as I do the language it's couched in. Because I'm one of these old-fashioned people that never got along with this Cartesian Newtonian idea that the universe is a big machine and that life is the unusual thing within it. I'm with the ancients. The universe is a gigantic meta-organism that contains other organisms, and the smallest part of it might be inert machines that are built. So I'm coming out of a cosmology that's very old and very ancient. So I don't view this as another reality piercing the veil and getting into our reality. I view that as having been the reality all the time. It's that Cartesian, Newtonian, materialistic, Victorian steampunk universe that we've been living in for the last 300 to 400 years. That's the illusion.
And Hollywood.
And Hollywood and all of that nonsense. Now, that said, let's look at those neurons and synapses, because you've got all these little tendrils, or for that matter, look at the pictures of the universal, intergalactic plasma. Just look at those pictures, folks. Just look at them. And you've got all these tendrils, just like you have with neurons and synapses. And I put these pictures in the book so that people can see the very real, very palpable resemblance between the two. So if the one is transducing intelligence in a brain, what's the other one doing? Particularly if it's of such a gigantic structure.
It's probably doing the same, right?
It's probably doing the same. Yeah. Ding, ding, ding. And here's the odd thing. The computer you and I are on right now, if you look at the circuitry, all right, if you diagram the circuitry, how does this computer process all of that information?
Electrical
Well,
signals,
not only electrical signals, but it uses
information.
either or gates. So the electricity goes in only one of two ways, a yes or a no, a 1 or a 0. So at every little nodal point within the electrical circuit where the computer is processing information, it's only got two paths to go. Now look at those neurons and synapses. Each one of them has more than two. In some cases, up to 5, maybe 7. Okay? So in other words, we don't think in a binary way. I keep telling people this. Get out of your either or universe and you're going to be a lot better off. That dialectical either or thinking is, as far as I'm concerned, stinking thinking. If you look at the neurons and synapses of a brain, it's almost like they're a quantum computer. Why? Because if you look at the quantum states of the electron, how many are there? 7. So instead of your and or gates in your computer now, imagine each one of those nodes in the circuit having not 2, but 7 possibilities to process that information. Oh, and looky, if you look at the flight notes on a keyboard, there are exactly 7 different notes. So in other words, what I'm getting at here is that the way the brain, any organic brain, processes information is much closer to the way electricity, and for that matter, quantum mechanics dealing with electricity, actually works. That's why quantum computing is the next great wave. Why? Because all of that computing power on our desks right now is ones and zeros. It's a binary system. Imagine having a base 7 system rather than a base 2 system at each of the nodal points in your computer. Your computer on your desktop overnight with that kind of processing capability becomes a supercomputer on your desk. That's what I'm getting at here. So in other words, this plasma life hypothesis, if true, it touches also upon this whole field of quantum computing and artificial intelligence, because you're dealing with a completely different way. Please understand this, a completely different way of processing information.
And you always mind blow me, Joseph.
Well, remember what Ellen...
You have a good way with words, and you put it in very well the context, everything.
Well, remember what Elon Musk's warning about artificial intelligence was. And, you know, the guy's not a dummy. He knows what's coming down the corner with quantum computing. His warning was, what if we invent this and somehow we manage to transduce an intelligence into it? A sentient, self-aware intelligence. Well, what I'm arguing is it's probably already there by the nature of the case.
So it's kind of like reinventing the wheel.
Right. We've been here before.
And then you also talk about crystals, what's in cell phones and computers.
Right.
Certain
and
types
DNA. Well, remember, the basic fact of all DNA is that it's an aperiodic crystal.
Explain the connection between, I've heard you on other interviews, explain the difference. And I think I heard you mentioned.
Well, look at the double helix. What is the double helix? It's a set of 4 proteins that are paired. And that set of pairings of all of the amino acids and compounds that make up each paired gene in the double helix is conveying information. But there's also the metastructure of the helix itself. There are these patterns, these Sometimes you can detect a clear grouping of types of genes in different places as you go up and down. And in other cases, that those patterns are without any sort of noticeable meta pattern. That's what I mean. So in other words, DNA itself is acting very much like a crystal. And the defects, here's the other point that I want to drill across to people. When you grow crystals, where do you grow them to have the least amount of lattice defects? In other words, if you look at a crystal like quartz that you find out, in nature, if you look at that quartz crystal, it's going to have these little odd things that don't quite fit with the rest of the crystal. Those are defects in the crystal that you can trace down to the very minute level of each molecule bonding to another molecule. It gets that tiny and that precise. And those defects have their own classifications. You've got screw defects, you've got lattice displacement offset defects, you've got a lattice defect that's been added to the structure, and so on. So what I'm getting at here is crystals are grown without defects or with a relative lack of defects, depending on where they're grown. And guess where that is?
Where's
zero gravity. If you grow a crystal here on Earth, it's much more likely to have those types of defects and more of them than a crystal grown in space.
You think that's something that they are secretly doing up there?
Let me finish. Crystals, in other words, are grown, and their lattice defects are a result of the environment or the context in which they are grown. So if you have a sufficiently advanced science of crystallography, which we don't have right now, other than we can probably tell the difference between a crystal grown in space and one grown here on Earth because of the amount and type of defects. So in other words, what I'm telling you is, with a sufficiently advanced science of crystallography, you will be able, by looking at the lattice defects in a specific crystal, to reconstruct more or less the environment, the surrounding space-temporal environment in which that crystal was grown. The crystal, in other words, is a memory. It is an archive of the conditions of space-time in which it was grown. And by the nature of the case, since DNA is also an aperiodic crystal, you, me, everybody, your dog, your cat, your frog, your parakeet, all of those things are also historical records of the space-time environment in which they were grown. In other words, there is a scientific conceptual basis to astrology. Let's go back to what I've said before. If you consult the oldest records about astrology, what did they say? That all of these observations and predictions that we make are based on observations that were taken over, here it comes, folks, tens of thousands of years. In other words, we've lost the ability to do what was once there. So crystals, the crystal in your computer is a historical record. The crystal grown out there on some asteroid is a record of all the events in which it was grown. We just haven't figured out how to read it.
You know what? There's damn, Joseph. That's all I can say is damn.
Yeah, well, this is in the book. It's in the Giza Death Star Revisited, and again, it's covered a little bit in the.
But it's the way, it's just the
Ekur.
way you're connecting dots here. You know, you know what that makes me think of with the crystals. I know you. It's not your favorite show, but I know you have watched Stargate SG-1.
Right.
Remember that one episode? I forgot the name of it. What season? It was a desert. They're out off world somewhere, and they're on some planet, and it had like a huge desert. The whole planet basically was just crystals.
Right.
and that was their archive system
Right.
for like information and all that. But I could be wrong. It's been a while since I've seen that episode. I want to say it also had their consciousness. I think, if I remember correctly, I could be wrong, but do you think that's one thing that these post-humanist and transhumanist, I'm not saying I want to go down that road, but it does all interconnect, that they're trying to, I'm not saying like implant consciousness.
I know what the question is you're trying to ask. Here is, and I hope people will latch on to this big time. What I'm about to say will make no sense to most people until they really think about it. And in order to really be able to think about it, you have to turn off your built-in modern antipathy to Christian theology. I'll repeat that. You have to turn off your modern built-in antipathy to Christian theology. Why? Because within that theology, if you understand it, if you really do the digging, and most people don't, you'll discover that at a certain point within the history of the Western Church, the identification was made between your soul and your individual personhood, such that all of the faculties of the soul become a defining feature, a definition, the content of your individual personhood. Now, here's the problem with that. And our language, if we pay close attention to our language in ordinary usage, tells us that there is a distinction between these two things, personhood and soul. Because we say, I have a soul. It's something you and I both possess. It's something that everybody listening to us possesses. But we also say, I am a person. I am not you.
Should we say, I don't mean to interrupt you, but should we say we are a soul and we have a person?
No, other way around. You are a person and have a soul. Why? Because the soul is that faculty of human nature that accounts for your mind, your will, your memory, your emotions. In other words, the sum total of you. But here's the problem. That sum total never adds up to you. You always exceed that sum total. At best, that sum total symbolizes you, makes you present, but you always exceed it. And the key lies in law. You have to really stop and think about that one. The key lies in law. Were you a person before you started to remember being a person?
You only remember so far back, though.
Bingo. Bingo. Are you a person if you're in a coma? Yeah.
I would say you are.
Yeah.
I would say
most of us would. We don't know where you are.
Yes, that's
your
why
body is here.
That's why I would say you. I would say you are, but
okay, but you get my point.
Yes,
you get my point.
Totally.
These two entities, the moment you start equating them and saying they're identical, you run into massive problems. So, in other words, what I'm suggesting to you is let's assume that you could download into a computer chip all of your mind, memory, will, emotions, and everything. Does that downloaded thing constitute you?
No.
No.
It's an artificial me.
It's an artificial you, because you are more than the sum total of all that stuff. That's where the transhumanists have been, I think, captive to a way of thinking about these very heavily metaphysical, philosophical, theological concepts. they have become captive to the equation of soul equals person. And by the way, once you say soul equals person, what else happens? Well, you can transmit by dint of the fact that we all have a soul, that we all have something in common. You can transmit moral culpability from one person to another. And therefore, you can make whole groups of people guilty of things that they've never done. Like sin nature, folks. Or like reparations for slavery, folks. Now, my ancestors weren't even here in this country during the antebellum period when slavery was constitutional and legal. Why should I pay a bunch of people I don't know for crimes I did not and my ancestors did not commit? How is it that you have this nutty idea that guilt can be transmitted by human nature? Well, it can be if you assume that person and soul are the same. The soul is the nature. The person is the individual person. So in other words, no, you do not inherit a sin nature from Adam and Eve. You do not inherit a moral culpability for their sin. What you inherit is the consequence of their sin, and that's death. Follow me, folks?
And that's why
are you getting how all of this is interrelated?
Yes.
Because it is. And you're not going to understand it, folks, unless you do the hard homework of finding out what the actual original theology really is. And I can assure you, it's not sin nature. Or to quote a 9th century guy from Byzantium, the idea that there is a sin of nature is a heresy. Take that, Pope. Take that, Protestant reformers. And the idea that you can download and upload consciousness goes right with it, folks. So good luck with that. You might be able to download my or your consciousness, but you're not going to be able to down or upload us.
Exactly. Yes. But even though one day, just like you said, yes, they will never be able to get us. But no. if they are these transhumanists, post-humanists, man, it just all intertwines, entertain all this. But if one day, it could be tomorrow, it could be 100 years, it could be 1,000 years,
right?
But they are trying to harness this plasma energy. Hello, CERN, possibly.
Yes.
So let's say they do harness that energy one day. 100
and
years,
by golly, in
years.
order to do it, we better have some strange rituals to inaugurate this thing in case we miss anything.
Could they create not an artificial like me or Joseph Farrell, but like an artificial great value version of a soul or consciousness or something like that?
Okay,
if they were to harness that energy.
Let me put the question to you this way. Ever met identical twins?
Yes.
Okay, what are they? They're essentially genetic clones. Okay. So are they the same person? Do they even have the same personalities? Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. So my point is, imagine if someone manages to clone you or me or anybody else. Does that mean they've managed to duplicate you? Again,
no. Maybe your physical appearance.
Maybe your physical appearance.
Yes.
And maybe that clone is going to have a very similar personality to you or me or whoever.
Maybe it depends on where, I don't know, play it devil's advocate. I don't know if I'm even playing devil's advocate. Maybe it depends on where they get that information from. Why I'm saying this is because I have a cousin. I have my uncle, my dad's brother. He drugs, alcohol, all his life. He's never been around my cousin ever. He is, because he was never in his life, but he is so he had no close quarter, like, but anyways, my cousin is a spitting image of him, every mannerisms, everything. So what I mean, could they tap into, if everything is ones and zeros, and they tap into the whatever that bits of
everything
information
isn't
is.
Ones and zeros. It's ones, twos, threes, sevens, decimals. You know,
I guess could
similar personalities arise from a similar genetic structure? Of course. What I'm asking is, how do we explain the exceptions to that?
Yeah.
How do we explain the identical cousins who aren't even remotely alike in terms of their personality or interests and so on? My point is that even when you're dealing with clear cases of, here it comes, genetic entanglement, okay, and what is entanglement, folks? It's the entanglement of spin states in particles. So change the one, an entangled particle with it will immediately change, even if it's on the other side of the universe. Okay.
Well, on the macro scale, that they say the Milky Way, the galaxies do that too. They spin.
Sure, exactly. So can you transduce or have a kind of personality entanglement like that? Sure. Does that mean you're the same person? No. Let me give you another example. Do you think it is possible that in all the long history of all the billions of human beings that have lived, that there's never any reproduction or similar genetic case of an individual that's ever arisen? Do you think that you are the only person that has ever looked like you and had similar interests, maybe from 1,000 years ago? Well, probably not.
Do you want to help support Beyond Forbidden and receive extra content that's not seen anywhere else? By becoming a Patreon, a few things you will receive are the full-length 90-minute or 120-minute podcast episode. Members will also receive a private link to the video podcast and will only be exclusive to Patreon members. In-person, face-to-face interviews with some of the most well-known, respected researchers. Behind-the-scenes footage of interviews not seen anywhere else. And that's just a few perks. So what do you have to lose? Cut out one brain-rotting, overly processed Happy Meal a month that doesn't do anything beneficial for your mind, body, and spirit, and become a Patreon for just $5.